Thank you, Carrie. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the ACEC Research Institute's Board of Directors, welcome to today's Future of Engineering Roundtable. A big thank you to our donors who have made this session possible. We have a great group of industry leaders with us today that are going to share their insights and expertise as we tackle the G in ESG, which is governance. I know based on the prep call we had last week, we've got a lot of great information to share with you today and lots of things to talk about. And I'm sure our listening audience has a few questions as well. So I want us to get started right away. I'll start by introducing two of our ACEC research consultants, our moderator for today's session, Kevin McMahon, and Joe Bates, who will be managing your questions in the chat box, as Carrie mentioned. Kevin, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce our wonderful panel and get us started.
Sure. Thank you very much. Our panel is very adroit at these governance issues, and we're really pleased to have them. First, we have Nate Beil. Nate's chairman of the board and CEO of KCI, which is headquartered in Maryland. Gail Roberts was president of Stanley Consultants for a number of years and is now president of Gail Roberts Consulting and is an independent director, and we'll share her views on that and other things. And Leslie Wong is a senior associate and practice leader for ESG at Langen. And Leslie brings a lot of practice area expertise to the table. The G is for governance, as Daphne said, and it relates to governance factors as how you run your firm. So it's as applicable for ESG as it is just in good governance practices to create a sustainable firm for the long term, creating value for you, your shareholders, and your stakeholders. We're going to cover a number of these issues. How does your firm protect the rights of shareholders, an increasingly important topic? Well, how do you get diversity, inclusion, commitment on your board? What are the benefits of independent directors and how do you get started? You promote workplace health, safety, and now wellness is added to the safety component of workplace activities. What do you do to set CEO compensation in an employee-owned firm? What are some good governance, employee disclosure practices and policies? How does an ESOP influence good governance and your activities in governing your firm? And how do you manage risk to create a sustainable firm that has a long runway into the future? So a lot to cover, and good governance is a significant part of creating value that's sustainable. And we're going to get started with the opening question. Opening question goes to Nate Beil. Nate, can you describe your ESOP? You do have an ESOP and your board composition, and does the ESOP require independent directors?
Certainly. Hey, thanks, Kevin. Yes, KCI is 100% subchapter S ESOP, have been so since 1998. We bring around 1,900 ESOP employees to the table. That's our entire population. And so from a size basis, I think we're probably in the middle of the pack. We're employee owned. We're not employee managed. We do have an outside director group. We have a board of directors, 4 outside directors, 5 inside. One thing I should mention is that one of our directors, full voting member, is from our employee committee. They serve on a 2-year term, and they're elected by anybody who is within the ESOP. So we take it to that level. We think the ESOP should be fully represented at the board. Our ESOP does not require outside directors. We think that's a good governance perspective. And our outside directors, we task them with heading our 4 subcommittees at the board: planning, governance, compensation, and then the audit committee. And we choose our outside independent directors for their expertise in those fields as well as other things. So fully engage the outside directors, Kevin, and they head those governance and the other committees. And we think they really do add value to the firm.
Well, that's really interesting, Nate. You have basically 3 constituencies represented. You have employees on the board, you have executives, and then you also have outside directors. That's a really well-rounded group. Gail, you were a former CEO of an employee-owned company. How has that experience influenced your views about serving all of the stakeholders and shareholders on the board?
Yes, good morning, and thanks, Kevin, for a great tee up for this session. All of the boards that I have served on, both Stanley Consultants and the boards that I've served on since I've retired from Stanley Consultants, are employee-owned companies. And so I always am in the boardroom thinking about the shareholders. They're top of mind, particularly because our shareholders are our employees. And so I'm always thinking about that when we're in the boardroom and we're making decisions. Because it's our employees since our employees are our shareholders, they're investing in the firm, and their investment is really linked to their financial security. So that weighs on me always. As an independent director, the first thing though that I always want to understand when I come on a board is to understand the values and the culture of the company, because we need to take those values and make sure we're upholding those values in the boardroom, and that we align all our decisions with the values and also with the company purpose. It seems like today, and even more so, the shareholders and all employees are looking for greater transparency from the board, and really to have a better understanding of what is the board's role and responsibility. And I think we owe that to them. We know more. We need to give our shareholders more information on what the board is doing to advance the company's strategy, and also to ensure that the board is making the company, doing the things that we need to do to make the company sustainable and successful for the future as well. So the shareholders are always in the boardroom through the directors that they elect, and so the shareholders are always top of mind.
Great, thanks for your insights. I want to follow up in a minute back to something Nate described with both of you. But before I do that, Leslie, you long ago, this movement towards independent directors became a big public company focus. It seems to have migrated not only in the engineering business, but to other industries as well, among smaller, more privately held firms. Where do you see that going, and what has driven this evolution in that practice?
Well, I think it is going to expand even beyond where it is now. There is a general consensus among employees who are considering joining companies that an independent director gives them more of a voice, which can sound a little ironic, but if the directors are all associated with the company without outside influences, it's a little too homogenous, and employees are looking for representation that is more diverse. And that diversity can come in cultural diversity, but it can also come in diversity of working in different industries, working in different roles, bringing a different perspective. And both employees and shareholders want the board to have a wide variety of perspectives to pick from when they are solving problems, because as we know, the problems are rolling in fast and furious, and a lot of them have never been faced before. Boards need to be nimble and diverse and well educated.
Leslie, you mentioned representing employees. You recently joined Langen as the practice group leader for ESG. Did the fact that Langen had some independent advisors, were you aware of that, and did that influence your decision to join a new firm?
It absolutely did. And with my background, you would assume that I would look at something like that before I joined a firm. But the movement I have found to be downright revolutionary is that young people look at this before they join companies. I know when I was right out of school in my first couple of jobs, I didn't look at governance. I didn't look at the board. That was the furthest thing from my mind. This is really at the forefront of young people's minds right now. And it is partly because of the ESG movement. They're familiar with ESG. They usually come into it through the environmental part, but then they learn the other two parts. And they have realized corporate governance is important to a company's security, to their resilience. And young people now have been through a lot in their short careers, and they're looking for stability and maturity in a company. And you get that through good governance.
Great, thanks, Leslie. Nate and Gail, I'd like to follow up on Nate outlined 4 committees that his company has: planning, governance, compensation, and audit. And they're all headed up by independent directors. Now that seems to me to be newer and progressive. And Nate, that requires a level of trust among employees and the other internal board members to accept the fact that these outsiders, quote unquote, are running these committees. Can you give us your thoughts on the evolution at your firm to develop that trust? And then Gail, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that matter as well.
So years ago, we actually didn't have any outside directors at all. And we started with 1, and then we literally got to where we are today with 4. Perhaps maybe the answer lies in, what do you expect from an outside director? And so we realized that, hey, we're engineers, we're scientists, we're construction managers, surveyors. We're not financial people by training. So let's just take the head of our audit committee, he's a gent named Ken Trout. He is a finance guru. And so we select our outside directors basically with 2 things in mind. 1, what is their areas of technical expertise that can help the company? Ken's happens to be finance. So it's a natural leadership style that he heads the audit committee. We also select them from a diversity perspective. As an example, Courtney Beeman, she runs her own company. She's president. She runs our governance committee, and she brings a lot of expertise in government. So whether you're talking about finance or planning, we select our directors for technical expertise that we don't have an abundance of in our own company, whether that's HR or finance or governance. And then secondarily, we take this board piece rather seriously. So if we are a diverse company, our board needs to be diverse as well, not just in expertise, but also age and gender.
Thanks, Nate. Gail, from your perspective, are most committees led by outsiders in the smaller to mid-sized firms, or is that an emerging trend?
I think Nate had a great answer on this. I think it's an evolution. Companies start to put external directors on their board, and then the next evolution is to have the trust to put external directors as chair of each of these committees. So just as Nate said, because we're bringing in external directors that have particular expertise that can lead these different areas. It usually seems like the comp committee and the audit committee are the first 2 that have external directors. You may still have the governance committee with internal directors. So that's something that will evolve over time. The other thing you mentioned, how do you develop trust? What I often see is that these committees they have a delegated responsibility from the board. And so you give assignments through the committee charters to the board, you give the committee's assignments through board delegation. The committees wrestle with different topics, with the things that they're responsible for, but often it's not the committees that then make the decisions. The committees bring their recommendations back to the board, and then it's up to the board to make approval or further discuss what the committee has wrestled with in their committee sessions. So I think having the committees work on things but still bring their recommendations and their ideas back to the board for further discussion and then board approval, it's a good process, and it helps develop trust between the board and the committees, and having external directors heavily involved in chairing these committees.
Thank you, Gail. Leslie, can I ask you, how do you get started? I'm a small firm. I'm growing. I've a board of a handful of internal directors. How do I get started going down this outside director route?
I think the best way to get started is to hire someone who's done it before to give you some advice on how to get started and develop a roadmap for your first couple of years. The first step, though, for just about any company is to take the plunge and hire that outside board member and start integrating them, and then carry through with the rest of your roadmap that you've designed with your consultant.
Thanks, Leslie. Nate, and then Gail, what do you think about getting started? How did you get started, Nate, at your firm?
Well, we got started with one person. And again, you move on. And I think make sure when you do it, that you're doing it for the right reason. And what I mean by that was, I know what a board member doesn't look like. And it's not a yes person to back up every decision that I proffer as chairman. And so the board should be an advisory group, in my opinion. It should challenge you and it should challenge management. If I can't explain to the board why I want to do something, it's probably not a good thing to do. So our board is selected for advice, they're selected for advisement, but they're also selected to make sure management is doing things in the best interest of the company.
Gail, do you like starting with one or two directors?
Yeah, fortunately with Stanley Consultants, my entire time on the board, we always had external directors that predated me. But I'm now on boards where I was the first outside board member to come on. And so it's a big shift. It really is a big shift. It's a big shift in the conversation, as I understand, that happens in the boardroom. My recommendation, if you can, to not just bring one on when you're getting started, but to bring two on. And I'm giving this as an external director that, an external director is one voice. And it feels like when there's only one external director, everybody all of a sudden turns to that external director and says, well, what's your opinion? And we're just one voice. And so if you can bring a second one on, it provides even more diversity and different experiences and perspectives coming from the outside. I typically see that when you bring on your first director, it is somebody, as Leslie said, has previous board experience, clearly. But also often the smaller firms want to bring on somebody from the industry, somebody that's maybe been CEO or in the C-suite of a larger firm that have been through many of the challenges that they will be facing in the upcoming years as they grow and move into a larger size firm. So I often see that the first external director actually is from the industry, and then you may migrate to bringing in external directors that are from different industries with different expertise.
Okay, great. Thanks, Gail. Joe, do we have any questions from the audience at this point?
We've got a good question here that the panelists have touched on a little bit, but I think there might be some interest in going a little bit deeper in terms of ensuring diversity on your board or among the directors. How do you approach that, particularly with traditionally underrepresented segments of society?
Leslie, why don't you take that one? And well, we let Nate and Gail contemplate their responses.
Sure. And I've had this question come my way many times, particularly in the arena of engineering and environmental consulting, which is very male dominated, or it has been male dominated, but a lot of the young professionals are female. And also we're getting more racial diversity as well. So the easy answer is go find someone. There has to be someone who's qualified. But even saying that, you don't want to hire someone simply to add diversity. You hire someone because they have the skill set you need. And if you can't find the diversity you want for your board right now, what will communicate to your employees that you will visit that diversity is to start training programs and mentorship programs for minorities and for women. So these young people who are coming up, sometimes in the majority, will have the training to be the board members of the future when they're mature.
Right. Nate, what's your perspective on this question?
We didn't limit ourselves initially, we don't limit ourselves today, to just recruiting from the AEC industry. Two of our best examples, one, we were looking for human resources and medical benefit type expertise. And we actually tapped the medical community and brought on board a gent named Bill Jews, who ran Blue Cross and Blue Shield for the greater Mid-Atlantic region. African-American person, but just tremendous technical expertise. And then on the finance side, and actually on the compensation side, we reached out to IBM, a gal named PJ Mitchell, who had just phenomenal compensation expertise. And so initially we went outside the industry for two reasons. One, different perspective, and it broadened our candidate pool. So we were successful with that.
Great insights, Nate. Thank you, Gail.
I think great answers from both Leslie and Nate. I'll double down on Leslie saying, first think about what expertise, what value you need from the director that you're looking for. The last thing any director wants to feel is that they're being interviewed to be able to fill a diversity slot. So first of all, make sure that you know what you're looking for as far as the value and expertise. And then, think about diversity of your board. I know everybody wants to improve the gender diversity, the minority diversity, but make that your long-term goal if you can't achieve that initially. And then continue to think about diversity as a whole, diversity of thought, diversity of age, diversity of background and experience. So diversity comes in a lot of different ways and have objectives of increasing that as you move along in the board.
Great, thank you so much, Gail. Let's turn to tables and take a look at a really hot topic, which is CEO compensation. In a lot of firms, this is something that is done, I would say very loosely, and I believe it's tightening up across the industry. Gail, start with you as an outside independent director and head of a comp committee or two along the way. What are some of the best practices that you've seen, that you've learned about, that you've helped develop relative to, being comp chair and setting CEO compensation at the board level?
Yeah, absolutely. All of my experience on boards has been that the compensation committee is chaired by an external director, and that the compensation committee sets the CEO's compensation. So, kind of going back to some of our earlier conversation, this may be an evolution and a trust building, but I think it's an important best practice for boards. So as I said, I find it's the CEO's comp comes out of the comp committee, generally chaired by an external director. And at some point, sometimes that compensation committee is strictly external directors, no internal directors at all. So that may be an evolution process as well. But it is a rigorous process. Kevin, you started out saying sometimes it's done loosely. When I find good governance, this is a very rigorous process. There's documentation around what you do every year. And following this process to set the CEO's compensation. The first thing, think about, does the company have a compensation philosophy overall? And we need to make sure as the head of the comp committee, are we following the company's compensation philosophy when we're considering the CEO's compensation? And then I think it starts with the annual goal setting of the CEO's goals to establish the CEO's expectations. And we always go first to financial metrics, but there's many different types of goals that we need to think about as far as the CEO goals around people development, succession planning, the strategy initiatives. There's so many things that, another one is advancing DE&I. So there's many things that we need to think about and set some very clear goals for the CEO. And then we need to measure them and evaluate the CEO annually. The next thing is we always go out externally for industry benchmarking for compensation, not only for salary, but for bonuses. So every year we're always looking at what is the external benchmarking for numbers as well. We always look at the next tier too. How does the CEO's compensation compare to the next tier of leadership? Not that we need to get into the details of what everyone's compensation is, but is it appropriate? Is what the CEO is being paid appropriate if we look at that in comparison to what the next tier is? And then we also often look at how is the overall bonus pool set? And then how is that distributed? Again, not getting into the details of every person, but making sure we understand what the philosophy is around rewarding performance awards and how those are equitably distributed as well. So again, a rigorous process. This is probably the most important thing that a compensation committee does. There's a lot of other things the comp committee does, but this is the number one responsibility.
Thanks, Gail. You outlined a lot of best practices. A couple that I want to just highlight: rigorous goal setting, and outside data to back up, what the compensation level should be. Leslie, do you feel that it's even possible to set the appropriate goals and compensation levels for CEOs in mid-sized firms without having an outsider involved in that process?
I don't think it's ideal, but I think it's possible. As an insider, what you have to do is step back and put yourself in the shoes of your employees. When they find out what the CEO makes, and they probably will, at least to some extent, will they think that is reasonable? Are you basing this on something that's reasonable? And if you follow what Gail said, she hit the nail on the head: benchmarking and metrics. If CEO compensation is in line with other CEOs in the industry at your size company, and if that CEO meets metrics that you have set, that's a very strong basis for compensation. And it's not necessary to have an outside person to level those requirements. It's just tougher.
It's just harder, yeah, to give your boss the bad news. Never
You
a
have
good
to have a
position
lot
to
of
be in.
confidence to say no to the CEO.
Yeah, I would say. Nate, asking somebody whose compensation level actually gets set by outsiders, how does that work? Do you have goals set by them? How do you participate in them? And how do you feel about this whole process?
Absolutely. And I couldn't echo Gail and Leslie's comments anymore. A great process. It's what we follow. I can add one thing. We do have an outside independent compensation consultant, which just to let everybody know, every officer at KCI's salary is set by the board. That includes base salary, comp, the whole 9 yards. And I think it's very important, at least in our company, that management doesn't set their own salaries, especially the CEO. There's just that just doesn't optically sound right to me. And I know not every company's in a position that we're in to have the financial wherewithal to hire outside help. But if you can, please do. One, it validates your responsibility. To Gail's point, take the outside benchmarks, use a third party if you can, and literally set the ranges and be rigorous about it. This is all about being defensible. In an ESOP company, I really think it's not defense, but you have to explain the compensation, and it starts with the philosophy. Stick to it. If you have to change the philosophy, go ahead. But once it's set, please make it almost policy. Be rigorous about it. We've used it at our company for, 30 years. And I've never had a problem with it personally. I think the compensation is adequate compared to peer groups. We do compare to peer groups: size, geography, public, private. So if you can fine tune the benchmarks independently done with a third party, I think it works well.
Great, Nate. Thank you for someone who's actually gone through it. Great comments. The next topic we're going to move to is about. Before we do, Joe, any questions from the audience on this important topic?
Yeah, it's great, I think, to hear all the detail here. One question, however, that I think is very interesting. Since sort of the 1970s, we've seen the difference, the ratio between the lowest paid and the highest paid in organizations has just, astronomically expanded. So this question has to do with, in your analysis, do you take into consideration or not the difference between the lowest paid and the highest paid?
Gail, why don't we start with you? That's a very good question, and in some of the bigger companies, it is enormous. Do we focus on that in this business?
Absolutely. We do ask. The Chief Human Resources Officer is always a resource to the compensation committee. So that is one of the things that we ask for. Give us some ratios of of the compensation at different levels of the company. So that is a data point that we get within the compensation committee. And then, as I mentioned, that at least what I'm experienced is that we really look at the level of the CEO's compensation to the next tier. And we can bench, you get the information of what the next tier's compensation should be. Is it in line with the industry benchmarks that you're looking at? And then make sure you're looking at that spread between the CEO and that next tier and see if that's appropriate. So yes, absolutely. This is all part of the rigorous process that we're trying to explain that does happen as you get larger as in the companies that we're working with.
Nate, at KCI, does your firm kind of take a look at this data and make sure that everybody's fairly compensated, which is really what this goal is?
Sure. I think we may take a little bit different approach. We certainly look at my salary compared to the next tier. That's done. The salary really is commensurate on, I'm going to say, level of responsibility, both financial and what you contribute. But I would like to add something, and it's part of compensation, at least at our company. Salary is salary. We've absolutely leveled the playing field on the contribution at the ESOP level. Whether it's myself or the entry-level person, we all get the same contribution as a percentage. Now, I understand it's a percentage of base salary, which then varies, but there's no difference between an entry-level person getting the same ESOP contribution on a percentage than I do. And I think that's important.
Yeah, that's a major part of your overall firm compensation.
It is. It's a part of our culture.
Yeah. Another factor, Nate, is your overall compensation is more variable and tied to performance than lower levels. Leslie,
Right.
how does that factor into this idea that the higher level executives' overall compensation package is geared towards more performance, whereas entry level folks are not?
Well, I think Nathan touched on it by saying it's defense, but it's not defense. Yes, you are put in a position of defending the CEO's salary when it is very disproportionate to the rest of your employees. So, trying to find these leveling spots such as benchmarking and metrics is a way to explain to the rank and file, yes, this person does make a lot more than you do, but it is necessary to set the pay at a certain level in order to get the best candidates. It is necessary to adjust the pay according to metrics, and it becomes a justification process.
Great,
Hey,
thanks.
Kevin, if I could
Yeah.
add just a
Go ahead.
second. So I came to the company 35 years ago as an entry-level engineer. I've held every doggone position that we can. And when I first came with the company, I always had the question, what's that person in the C-suite do? And are they really adding value to the firm? And the reason I add the comment is I think the compensation piece, at least from my chair, comes with a dose of, are you really adding value commensurate with the compensation? And are you humble about it? And that's a self-admission. But I'm trying to tell you that the compensation piece comes with an obligation that you just don't sit in the C-suite and work 6 hours a day and not 12 or whatever you do. There's an obligation with the salary. And if they're lined up, I think most people can understand the delta. It's just an observation.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think Gail said it, when a rigorous analysis of goals and the leadership's relationship to achieving those goals is really important versus just occupying a seat. Let's move the discussion to employee well-being. About 15 years ago, I think safety became more conscious in the engineering business than it was. It was, certainly conscious in construction, but not as much as in our consulting engineers. I think it's come a long way. Employee well-being is now a big topic we hear a lot about. I don't believe we heard that much about it 5-6 years ago. It's related to COVID, but not necessarily only so. Nate, what are you doing with this this new word and new phrase, employee well-being, and how do you think about it from your seat?
Well, I chuckle a little bit. It might be a new word, but it's not a new concept. And I think we take the concept of wellness beyond, I'm going to say, a traditional healthcare definition. So for us, it's about career wellness, certainly about financial wellness. We actually bring financial planners to our offices with wide open advice sessions, generic. If they want to engage them personally, that's fine, but at least have access to financial planners well before retirement shows up. We've brought physicians into the company to talk about annual physicals. And I always joke, we joked at the planning session, the male population at KCI isn't as good as the female population. Only 18% of our guys have annual physicals, 89% of the gals do. We've got to work on that. And so wellness at KCI takes on a lot of places. The most recent thing we've done is to help fight the pandemic. We've instituted UV lights, temperature scanners. We're about to put a photocathodic oxide, that's a big word, a PCO system in place that literally kills 30 pathogens. So wellness at KCI takes a lot of forms. Ultimately, it's about our employees. I mean, you've heard people say, our assets go home every night, folks. And so you've got to figure out how to best care for them, how to best proffer them, give them a really place that they want to come to work for.
Awesome. Gail, I've heard on the last actually webinar we did about social, a lot of having an environment where people can be their authentic self. And that ties in, I believe, to employee well-being in a broader sense. What do you think firms are doing? What are you participating in to get firms to think about the whole employee experience and some of the attributes Nate mentioned?
Yeah, I think this is becoming maybe the most critical thing that I'm seeing. You know, and I take this the discussion around employee well-being to our employee recruitment and retention. It seems to be this is just critical right now, and it's probably more critical than any time I've ever seen in my career. So, but yet everything has changed. I think since COVID, everything has changed about employee well-being. I mean, when we talk about recruitment and retention, we're hearing so many people leaving just because their exit interview answer is they're just burnt out. So what I'm seeing is that companies are just taking a completely new look at employee benefits because everything has changed. Like start over and just look at what do you need to be thinking about for employee well-being going forward. And it starts around maybe what are the benefits right now. It feels like even though the turnover is higher, and we're all struggling with why is turnover higher, it feels like our employees are looking for more flexibility, but they're still looking for stability. And they're looking for a company that they can call home and that they can have the opportunities. So, you know, then we extend that to, you know, are you doing employee engagement surveys? Are you listening to what your employees are telling you now? Because they're telling you something much different than they may have 2 years ago or 3 years ago, or even even a year ago when we were in the midst of all of this. So if you can go out and talk to your employees, do some employee engagement surveys, listen to what they're telling you. And what we're hearing is that, you know, up the game as far as supervisory skills. You know, maybe that's an old adage, you know, people leave their supervisors, but, you know, this is the time that the supervisor role has definitely changed with more people working with remote, the flexible work environment. So that's important for creating a good employee environment. People are looking for leadership development. They're looking at how to advance their careers, outlining their career development. So while people are leaving, sometimes they're leaving because they say, well, I just didn't see an opportunity. And we say, how can that be? You know, there's so many opportunities here. So I think this is the time to take an entirely new look at recruitment, retention, the employee environment. And we've got some great opportunities here.
Great, thanks, Gail. Leslie, you know, obviously this war for talent in our business, as Nate and Gail described, employee well-being. Can you give us some specifics, or what are some employee-friendly policies that you think will pay off in today's environment where retention is so critical and everyone's facing a challenge there?
All right, and particularly in engineering, any kind of service industry where you are not making a widget, you're providing a service and you're dependent upon people. That means you're dependent upon work hours. And that means sometimes it's very difficult to balance those work hours and you can suffer burnout. What you can do to control that is to put some policies in place and above all, monitor what is going on. If you have a work group that is putting in so many hours, counter that rush period when they finish the project with some bonus time off. If you have a particularly burdened staffing category, provide some backup. And I know that's easy to say, we could barely find this person, how do I supply a backup? Well, if you can't find an equivalent for a backup, get them an assistant. But everyone needs to know that they can take time off for major life events, for an occasional vacation. You cannot run people 24/7. But the most important thing about these policies is to not make them random, make them institutionalized in the system. So people know when they're overworked, they're going to get rewarded with some time off or with some backup. Or if you have no other choice, at least give them some additional compensation. What really leads to burnout is not believing you'll be rewarded for the extra work you're putting in. People who are motivated often don't mind putting in that work if they know they'll be rewarded.
Thanks, Leslie. And I think sometimes baby boomers pushing that this is how I grew up and I, worked in the salt mines is we're our own worst enemy. Joe, any questions from the audience on this topic?
So no new questions on this topic, Kevin, but we have one that came in toward the end of the last section. So I thought it'd be great to ask this if we could just for a minute. It's a very specific, where do you get comparable salaries for CEOs since most companies are private?
Okay. Gail or Nate, you guys do it all the time. How about you go first, Gail? What do you use in some of your responsibilities?
This may be a plug to some of the third-party partners, but of course, every year, we always get the information from EFCG and AC advisors. That tends to be two that we know are done every year, and it includes a lot of private industry information. Another one that I'm seeing companies use is ERI, which is Employee Research or Economic Research Institute. So there seems to be a good database for that as well. It does feel like, and I can name a couple other ones as well through PSMJ, Zwag White, some of those that we get. But you also have to look at what are the data points in your particular size of company. And you get to a point as your company grows larger that the data points may be less in the outside resources that you had been using. So you always have to be looking at what external resources are available. And you have to change those as the company grows as well, because it doesn't always stay the same.
Great. Nate?
I don't have anything else to add. I can tell you two things. The number of sources has dwindled over the years. I mean, that's just a true statement. The other thing, don't ignore the publicly traded companies. Now, they tend to be larger. I understand that, but it does, and it does give you a data point. So for us, it's AEC, it's EFCG. It's exactly what Gail said. Again, that third-party compensation consultant that we have has access to some databases that the industry does not. So that's the only thing that I would add.
And Nate, what is the name of that one, if you don't mind?
Yeah, it's compensation consultants. Hang on a second. I've got it lying around here somewhere.
Okay.
Jen's name is Dave Ryan. It's GPS compensation consultants, I believe.
Okay.
And
Great.
if you want me to, I can get you the contact information that you can distribute, Kevin, if that's what you'd like.
Okay, awesome. Thanks. Yeah, a lot of times, some of the databases have over the years been been off a little bit, and it's great to give some people some specific places. We're gonna go to try to get a few more questions in, and I'm going to hit a couple of the panelists for answers, and then we'll kind of try to do something a little quicker on a few things so we can get as much covered. We'll start with Leslie. Leslie, what's the biggest risk that you see for on this G topic for engineering firms? What is the risk that a lot of folks run for not adopting some of these best practices?
Well, I think the biggest risk for not adopting a formalized practice is that you're going to miss out on opportunities, and you may not even realize the opportunities you're missing out on. And those opportunities come in the form of employees who don't join your firm because a formalized program is important to them. And this can be employees at any level. This can be investors who do not have confidence in a company that does not have a formalized program. This can even be on the project level. There are firms now collecting information on engineering firms, whether they have E, S, and G programs in place. There are going to be some project managers who say, you know, if you refuse to fill out the survey or you don't have a formalized program, I think you're a risk. So it's important that you do something. And
Okay.
I understand a lot of small firms don't have a big budget, don't have a lot of bandwidth. No one is expecting you to meet the metrics of a megalith corporation. But do something, get on the books, be transparent, and you'll gain a lot from it.
Awesome. Nate, in your world, which sounds more complicated to the audience, I think, than we had expected, you're thriving in it. What impacts your thinking the most about continuing institute good governance practices?
Well, again, for us, and I don't know that we're complicated or more complicated than most. It's just the scale factor. I think most people on this call wrestle with the same comments or the same questions that I do. I may have 50 of them a day, they may have 5, but the gist is the same. I'd offer one piece of advice. If you can get your company's culture, the value statement from your employees, and the value statement from your clients, if you get that right, it is amazing how you can apply that to almost any topic that comes up in business. And when you get it right, it's pretty doggone simple. If you're out of alignment, you're always spending energy trying to deal with stuff that's out of alignment. So I know it sounds like a big company answer, but I don't care how large you are. If the company culture lines up with the employee culture and your clients, life gets pretty doggone simple. At least you have a consistent basis to address issues, even the pandemic, right? I mean, nobody saw that coming. How you treat people is how you treat people, regardless of what the topic is. So spend some time on that. The dividends they're gargantuan. They have been for us.
Awesome. And one thing I think everyone here has in common is when you go visit a larger client, whether it's a public or private company, commiserating about your outside directors is often a good topic of conversation. So you certainly have something to talk about. Gail, let me turn it to you. And there's a number of employee disclosure policies that are out there, and some firms have adopted some and others are yet to be adopted. You know, they include code of conduct, conflict of interest, ethics, hotline training. Can you just describe one of the things that you think is important for small and medium firms to adopt, and you know, the levels of complexity of those topics that are out there?
Yeah, you know, Kevin, you've mentioned a lot of good different disclosures. You know, there's so many aspects of good governance, you know, but it all comes back to, I think we need to have more transparency. And so first of all, it's like, how do you communicate what the board is doing? You know, so there are things like code of conduct statements, conflict of interest policies, ethics hotline. But if we go back to good governance basics, it seems like the very first thing that every board needs to have is a board charter, which clearly outlines the roles and responsibilities of the board. and follow that and communicate that with all of the employees as an employee disclosure. We've also talked about committees, and there's good governance around committees. So have committee charters that are well defined, what the roles and responsibilities are of each committee. And you'll find as you develop those charters, if you don't have those, or if you haven't reviewed those in a while, there's going to be aspects of ESG in each of those board documents, not only the board charter, but also each of the board committees. And then maybe not associated with this question, but it feels like we always have to just make sure we have board education, particularly with internal directors. This may be a new role for them. And they are good spokespersons back out to the company and back out to other shareholders. But I think we owe it to our internal directors to make sure we provide board education so they understand what their fiduciary responsibilities are. And also understand that when you take that board seat, there's a difference between your board role and your management role.
Mhm.
So I think that's something that I feel like the internal directors come on and they may not have been given that. Have the documents of their roles and responsibilities, the committees they're on, but also understand really what does it mean to be on the board of directors.
Very, yeah, very, very good answer. And actually, a training program for internal directors is a great idea. Thanks so much for that. Joe, before we go to the infamous last question for our panelists, any questions hovering out there from the audience?
No other questions at this time, Kevin.
All right, great, Joe. Thanks. Nate, one of the things that I think intrigues some of our audience who have ESOPs or are thinking about ESOPs is you're running a pretty large firm with an ESOP. You've got a lot of things moving and opportunities in front of you. Is it complicated with the ESOP, or does that just blend into just being CEO of a larger firm and it's not much more complicated than if you didn't have one?
So here's how I look at it. I view the ESOP as an ownership model, not a business model. We have, like I said, 1,900 owners. The business of the business would be there with or without the ESOP. We just happen to share a lot of our profits with ESOP owners. And so if you can kind of view it along those lines, the beauty of our ESOP is that ownership and leadership are separate. So we focus on good leadership, we focus on good succession, we focus on good business practices. Governance is obviously one of them. The outcome, and I truly believe this is an outcome, the outcome is profit and returning financial value to our ESOP owners. So I don't know that there's a difference, Kevin. There's a transparency. I feel a greater need to be more transparent, but I think we would do that regardless of ownership. I mean,
Okay.
I don't know if I answered your question.
No, I like it's an ownership model versus a management
is.
business.
I believe so.
Very good answer and good words to live by. Leslie, what do you see? You know, you're out there practicing ESG all the time, and more people are obviously cognizant of it. What do you see that is the biggest improvement that the overall engineering industry needs in terms of governance?
In terms of governance,
Practices.
definitely to adopt some of those employee policies. The employee management policies, the wellness policies, and make sure they populate throughout your company. Because if you don't implement those, you're not really communicating your governance down to the employee level. They're the ones who benefit from those policies, and they are going to gain a lot of trust in the board and in management when they see that the board and management lives up to their commitments when they establish those policies.
Okay, thank you so much. The average 100-person firm has a 20 million plus investment in its payroll. And I often think, even though I never looked at it like that, that this is your most important asset and you need to kind of worry about it every day. Gail, you were CEO a few years ago. Now you've been out visiting different companies, sitting on different boards, being an independent director. You've learned a lot. What do you wish you had done differently back in the day when you were CEO to spend your governance time more wisely?
Yeah, I think, first of all, some of what we've discussed, every board seat is just a valuable voice to the entire company. So make sure we're getting the right people in the boardroom and spend time thinking about, the expertise that we need in the boardroom. So diversity of thought, skills, experience. So first of all, get the right people into the room. And then the next thing I thought about when I was CEO, I felt like, we were working on board reports. We would have a board meeting and it felt like I was always working on board reports. And board reports are important. I read a lot of great board reports. But in the boardroom, I think we need to, when we talk about this, but it's hard to do, have less reporting and more conversations, more forward-looking conversations. We can read all the board reports before we come into the boardroom. If we have questions, ask questions, but really spend that valuable time in the boardroom having forward-looking conversations. And don't be insular. Make sure that we're continuously talking about the trends that are impacting us from the external, that we need to make sure that we're talking about inside the boardroom so that we can be proactive. So a lot more conversations and a lot less reporting would be my what I would like to do, or what I've learned, I guess, over the last few years.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question unless Joe has one. The question I'll ask if Joe doesn't have one is give us a 2-word answer on what the biggest risk you think engineering firms face over the next 5 to 10 years. Joe, is there a question out there that, or should we ask that one?
No, let's go ahead with yours, Kevin.
Okay, Nate, what do you think it is?
Loss of intellectual knowledge at the client level.
Okay, that's the brain drain, so to speak. Gail?
Leadership development and retaining our good people.
Okay, and Leslie?
2 words, brain drain, but at the employee level.
Okay, great, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Daphne for wrap-up comments, but you were an awesome panel. It was an honor asking you some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin, Joe, and to our wonderful panel. Thank you all for joining us today. And, thanks to our panelists for sharing some really insightful thinking. I know our attendees appreciate the details and the very specific examples that we gave, the recommendations you provided. You've really given us a lot to think about and some great ideas on how to get started, which I think is valuable as well. So a special shout out to our ACEC Research Institute donors who have made this roundtable possible. We invite each of you on the call to think about how you and your firm might consider supporting the Institute. And we do have a short evaluation that we will send you this afternoon. So please share your thoughts with us, your experience. It does help us make these better. And with that, I will say have a wonderful afternoon and stay well. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your attention, everyone.
Thank you.